I was grilling burgers on a Tuesday evening when Patricia Cunningham marched across my lawn like she owned it, clipboard in hand and lips pursed so tight they could crack walnuts. I had been living in my house in Maple Ridge, a planned community outside Charlotte, North Carolina, for 3 years without incident, but apparently my peaceful existence was about to end. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the sizzle of my perfectly seasoned patties. "We need to discuss a serious violation." I set down my spatula and turned to face her, already feeling my blood pressure rising. Patricia was the president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, a position she wielded like a medieval warlord with a battle axe. She was 52, wore her blonde hair in that classic speak-to-the-manager style, and had made it her life's mission to ensure every resident lived in terror of HOA fines. "What violation would that be, Patricia?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She thrust a document at me, her manicured nails gleaming in the evening sun. "Your fence is 6 inches over the property line. According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our community guidelines, all structures must be contained within the homeowner's legal boundaries. You have 14 days to relocate it, or you'll face fines starting at $500 per day." I stared at her, genuinely confused. 6 inches? How do you figure that? "The association had measurements taken last month during our property compliance audit," she said, tapping her clipboard with authority. "Your fence clearly encroaches into the common area near the eastern boundary of your lot. This is unacceptable." The fence in question was a simple 6-foot privacy fence I had installed 2 years ago after getting my golden retriever, Max. I had been meticulous about the placement, even checking the property survey I received during closing. "Patricia, I have the survey from when I bought the house. That fence is well within my property lines." Her smile was condescending. "Well, our measurements say otherwise. Perhaps your survey was incorrect or perhaps you misread it. Either way, the fence needs to move. 14 days, Mr. Henderson." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, which sat 3 lots down from mine on Magnolia Drive. I stood there, burger smoke billowing around me, feeling like I'd just been sucker punched. $500 per day after 2 weeks? That was insane. I went inside, dug through my filing cabinet, and pulled out the property survey from 2021. According to the detailed measurements and the clearly marked boundaries, my fence was a full 18 inches inside my property line. There was no way I was encroaching on anything. The next morning, I called the surveyor who had done the original work, a company called Piedmont Land Surveys. The receptionist put me through to Bill Morrison, the surveyor who had handled my property. "Bill, this is David Henderson from the Maple Ridge development. You did my survey back in 2021, and now my HOA is claiming my fence is over the property line. Can you help me out?" Bill's voice was warm and professional. "Sure thing, David. Let me pull up your file. You're on Magnolia Drive, right? Lot 47? "That's me," I heard typing on his end. "Okay, I've got your survey here. According to our measurements, your property extends well beyond where I assume your fence is located. Based on the photos in the file, you've actually got quite a bit of room on all sides. What's the HOA claiming?" I explained Patricia's accusation about the 6-inch encroachment on the eastern boundary. Bill was quiet for a moment, and I could hear papers rustling. "David, that doesn't make sense. Your eastern boundary is actually the back of your lot, and it extends to within 2 feet of the tree line. Unless you built your fence into the woods, which I doubt, you're nowhere near the property line. Tell you what, let me come out and do a verification survey. Given the circumstances, I'll do it for cost. If your HOA is making claims like this, you need current documentation." We scheduled him for that Friday, 4 days away. In the meantime, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I walked the perimeter of my property with a measuring tape, comparing the distances to the markers shown on my survey. Everything checked out. My fence was exactly where it should be. That evening, I knocked on the door of my neighbor to the east, Tom Bradshaw. Tom was a retired firefighter, a straight shooting guy in his 60s who had lived in Maple Ridge since the development was built in 2015. "David, come on in," he said, waving me inside. "What brings you by?" I explained the situation with Patricia and the fence. Tom's expression darkened as I talked. "That woman is something else," he muttered. "She tried to find me last year because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black." "The wrong shade of black, David. I had to bring in paint samples and everything. He shook his head. But your fence, that's ridiculous. I can see it from my back window. It's nowhere near the property line. Did the HOA do measurements on your property during this audit? I asked. Tom nodded. Yeah, some guy came around with a measuring wheel. Took about 5 minutes and left. Didn't say much to anyone. I figured it was just busy work to justify Patricia's existence. Did they claim you had any violations? Nope, I was clean. But then again, I don't have any structures near my property lines. My shed is smack in the middle of my yard. I thanked Tom and headed home, my mind churning. Something about this whole thing felt off. Why would Patricia target my fence specifically? It wasn't like it was an eyesore. It was well maintained, properly stained, and completely unremarkable. There had to be more to this story. Friday arrived and Bill Morrison showed up at 8 in the morning with his assistant, a young woman named Jennifer, who carried what looked like a high-tech surveying instrument. They spent 3 hours taking measurements, checking angles, and comparing their findings to the original survey. When Bill finally knocked on my door, his expression was serious. David, can we talk inside? We sat at my kitchen table, and Bill spread out a new survey drawing along with my original. Your fence is fine. It's 22 inches inside your eastern property boundary. The HOA's claim is completely false. So I can tell Patricia to pound sand? Bill's eyes glinted. You can, but there's something else you should know. While we were verifying your boundaries, we naturally checked the adjoining properties to make sure our measurements were accurate. Your northern boundary abuts the common area, and your southern boundary connects to lot 46. But your eastern boundary, the one where your fence is, actually extends further than the original survey indicated. I frowned. What do you mean, further? There was an error in the original plat map for the development. It's not uncommon. When we checked the legal description against the actual monuments and did a comparison with neighboring surveys, we found that your property line extends an additional 43 feet beyond what was originally recorded. My brain struggled to process this. 43 feet? Correct. Which means a significant portion of what's currently designated as common area is actually your private property. And here's where it gets interesting. Bill pulled out his phone and showed me several photos. See this? The photos showed the community pool area, a nice setup with a heated pool, hot tub, and surrounding deck that the HOA maintained. I had been there a few times over the years. What about it? I asked. That pool sits entirely on what is legally your property, David. The eastern edge of your lot extends right through the middle of the pool area. We're talking about the entire pool, the hot tub, the deck, the changing rooms, all of it. It's on your land. I sat back in my chair, stunned. You're absolutely sure about this? Positive. I've triple-checked the measurements. The original developer made an error when plotting the lots, and it was never caught. Your deed and legal description are clear. That land is yours. A slow smile spread across my face as the implications sank in. Patricia had come after me for a 6-inch encroachment that didn't exist, and now I had leverage that would blow her mind. Bill, I need you to document all of this in an official survey report. Whatever it costs, I'll pay it. Already started on it. You'll have a complete package by Monday, including all the photos, measurements, and a comparison with the original plat. I'll also include a letter explaining the discrepancy. I thanked Bill and spent the weekend in a state of anxious anticipation. I didn't tell anyone what I had discovered, not even Tom. I wanted to have all my documentation in order before I made any moves. Monday morning, a thick envelope arrived via courier from Piedmont Land Surveys. Inside was a comprehensive survey report, complete with professional diagrams, photographs, and Bill's detailed explanation of the boundary error. The evidence was irrefutable. I made copies of everything and then sat down to plan my next move. I could simply go to Patricia and show her the survey, but something told me that wouldn't be enough. She had come at me with threats and demands, treating me like I was some kind of rule-breaking criminal. I wanted her to understand the magnitude of her mistake. That afternoon, I drafted a formal letter to the Maple Ridge HOA board. I explained the fence situation, attached Bill's survey showing my fence was well within my boundaries, and then included the bombshell about the pool. I kept my tone professional but firm, requesting an immediate withdrawal of the fence violation notice and a formal apology. I also suggested that we needed to discuss the pool situation in person. I sent the letter via certified mail to ensure there was a record of delivery. Then I waited. 3 days passed in silence. On Thursday evening, I was washing dishes when I saw Patricia's car pull into my driveway. She got out, her face flushed red, and marched to my front door. Her knocking was aggressive, almost pounding. I took my time drying my hands before answering. "Evening, Patricia." "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, waving a copy of my letter. "This is absurd. Our pool does not sit on your property. This is some kind of scam." "It's not a scam. It's a professional survey conducted by a licensed surveyor. The original plat map had an error. My property extends much further east than anyone realized." Her face was turning purple. "This is harassment. You're trying to weasel out of a legitimate violation by making up lies about property boundaries." I kept my voice calm. "Patricia, my fence was never over the property line. Your measurements were wrong, but more importantly, the pool issue is real. I have all the documentation. You can hire your own surveyor if you don't believe me. But the results will be the same. We own that pool. The HOA built it in 2016. We've maintained it for 8 years. You built it on my property without permission. That doesn't make it yours." She was breathing hard, her hands trembling. "The board will never accept this. We'll fight you in court." "That's your choice, but you'll lose. The legal description in my deed is crystal clear. Talk to your attorney if you want, but they'll tell you the same thing." Patricia stormed off without another word. I watched her car screech out of my driveway and disappear down the street. I had expected anger, but the sheer level of her fury was something else. The next morning, I received a call from an attorney named Richard Chen. "Mr. Henderson, I represent the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. I've reviewed your letter and the attached survey. I need to schedule a time to meet with you and discuss this matter." "I'm available this weekend," I said. "How about Saturday morning, 10 o'clock at the community center?" "I'll be there." Saturday arrived, and I walked into the community center conference room to find not just Richard Chen, but the entire 5-member HOA board, including Patricia. She wouldn't make eye contact with me. The other board members looked uncomfortable. Richard was a sharp-dressed man in his 40s, and he got right to business. "Mr. Henderson, I've had a chance to review your surveyor's report in detail. I also hired an independent surveyor to verify the findings. I'm sorry to say that your survey appears to be accurate. The pool and surrounding facilities do sit on property that is legally yours according to the recorded deed." Patricia made a strangled noise but said nothing. "So where do we go from here?" I asked. Richard leaned back in his chair. "That depends on what you want, Mr. Henderson. The association is prepared to negotiate a solution that works for everyone." I'd spent the last few days thinking about exactly this question. I could demand they remove the pool, which would cost the HOA hundreds of thousands of dollars and destroy a community amenity that everyone enjoyed. Or I could use this as leverage to fix some of the real problems in Maple Ridge. "Here's what I want," I said. "First, the violation notice against my fence is withdrawn immediately and formally. Second, I want Patricia removed as HOA president. She's been aggressive, unprofessional, and has created a hostile environment for homeowners. Third, I want a revision of the HOA rules to make them more reasonable. The current guidelines are oppressive, and the fine structure is designed to punish, not encourage compliance." Patricia shot to her feet. "You can't demand I be removed. I was elected by the residents." "You can be removed by the board for cause," I said, looking at the other members. "And I think creating a legal nightmare for the association by making false violation claims qualifies as cause." One of the other board members, a woman named Sandra Lewis, cleared her throat. "Patricia, maybe you should step outside for a moment." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Richard gave her a firm nod. She left the room, slamming the door behind her. Sandra turned to me. "Mr. Henderson, I want to apologize. Many of us on the board have been concerned about Patricia's approach for a while now, but she's very forceful, and it's been difficult to push back. What you're asking for is reasonable, but removing a board president requires a vote." "Then vote," I said simply. The board members looked at each other. Finally, a man named Greg Patterson spoke up. I move that we remove Patricia Cunningham as president due to conduct unbecoming of the position and place the association at legal risk. Seconded, Sandra said immediately. Richard looked around the table. All in favor? 4 hands went up. Only one member, an older man named Harold, who had always been Patricia's ally, abstained. Motion carries, Richard said. Now, regarding the other issues. Mr. Henderson, we can certainly withdraw the fence violation. That's not a problem. As for the rules revision, that's more complicated. The current rules were approved by a vote of the membership. Any major changes would need to go to another vote. Fair enough, I said. But I want the board to propose reasonable revisions and put them to a vote within 90 days, and I want the fine structure revised immediately. $500 a day is predatory. Richard made notes on his legal pad. I think we can work with that. Now, the bigger question is the pool. What do you want to do about the property situation? I had given this a lot of thought. I'm willing to grant the HOA a permanent easement for the pool area, but I want it formalized in writing. And I want certain conditions. The pool must be maintained to a high standard. The HOA must carry adequate liability insurance that names me as an additional insured. And if the association ever decides to remove the pool, the land reverts to me, and they're responsible for restoration. That seems very reasonable, Sandra said, looking relieved. Richard nodded. I can draft an easement agreement that includes those terms. Anything else? Yes? I want a formal written apology from the board for the false violation claim, and I want it posted in the community newsletter. There was silence for a moment. Then Greg spoke up. You've got it. This whole thing has been handled badly from the start. We owe you that much. We spent the next hour hammering out the details. Richard would draft the easement agreement and the revised fine structure. The board would work on proposed rule changes to present to the membership. And Patricia would be informed that she was no longer president, though she could remain on the board if she chose. As we were wrapping up, Sandra pulled me aside. David, I want you to know that most of us aren't like Patricia. We want Maple Ridge to be a nice place to live, not a police state. Thank you for standing up to her. A lot of people have been too intimidated. I left the meeting feeling like I had accomplished something important. It wasn't just about the fence or even the pool. It was about pushing back against the petty tyranny that HOAs could become when the wrong people got power. Over the next few weeks, things moved forward. Richard drafted an easement agreement that was fair and comprehensive. I signed it after having my own attorney review it, and it was officially recorded with the county. The HOA formally withdrew the fence violation and published an apology in the April newsletter. Patricia remained on the board but was notably silent at meetings. The real change came when the board proposed new rules and a revised fine structure. They had actually listened to feedback from residents, and the new rules were significantly more reasonable. Fines started at $50 for first violations, with a warning period before any fines were assessed. The ridiculous restrictions on mailbox colors, lawn ornaments, and other minor issues were relaxed. The changes passed with an overwhelming majority when put to a vote. I thought that was the end of it. I had won. The community was better for it, and life could return to normal. But then, about 6 weeks after the board meeting, I got a call from Tom Bradshaw. David, you need to see this, he said, his voice tight. I walked over to Tom's house and found him in his backyard with another neighbor, Maria Gonzalez. They were standing near the fence line between Tom's property and the common area. What's going on? I asked. Maria pointed to a series of spray-painted marks on the ground. Someone's been marking boundaries all around the common areas. We think Patricia is trying to find other property discrepancies to use against people. I examined the marks. They were survey indicators, the kind used to show measurement points. When did these show up? This morning, Tom said. And it's not just here. They're all over the neighborhood, at least a dozen properties. A bad feeling settled in my stomach. Patricia wasn't the type to let things go. She had been humiliated, removed from power, and forced to watch as her authoritarian rule structure was dismantled. Of course, she was looking for revenge. I pulled out my phone and called Bill Morrison. Bill, it's David Henderson. I think I need your help again. I explained the situation with the survey marks. Bill was quiet for a moment. David, If someone is doing unofficial surveys and marking properties without authorization, that's a problem. Survey marks have legal implications. Let me make some calls and see if anyone pulled permits or hired a licensed surveyor in your area. Bill called me back 2 hours later. No one has pulled survey permits for Maple Ridge in the last month except us. Whoever is making those marks isn't doing official surveys. That's actually illegal in North Carolina. You're not allowed to create false survey markers. What should I do? Document everything, take photos of the marks, and you might want to talk to the HOA board. If someone is creating boundary disputes, that affects the whole community. I contacted Sandra Lewis, who had taken over as HOA president after Patricia was removed. She was shocked by the news and immediately called an emergency board meeting for that evening. At the meeting, Sandra addressed the issue head-on. We need to find out who's behind this. Fake survey marks could create serious legal problems for homeowners. Patricia sat at the far end of the table, her arms crossed, saying nothing. Greg Patterson pulled up security footage from the community center's cameras, which covered part of the common area. We fast-forwarded through several hours of footage until we found something interesting. At 2 a.m. the previous night, a figure in dark clothing had moved through the common area with what looked like spray paint. "Can you zoom in?" Sandra asked. Greg enhanced the image as much as possible. The person's face wasn't visible, but something about the build and movement was familiar. "That's Patricia," Maria said suddenly. She had been invited to the meeting as a witness to the marks. "Look at the way she walks. I've seen her walk across the neighborhood 1,000 times." All eyes turned to Patricia, who had gone very pale. "Patricia, is that you on the video?" Sandra asked. "I don't have to answer that," Patricia said, her voice shaky. "Actually, you do," Richard Chen said. He had been invited to the meeting as well. Creating false survey marks is a crime in North Carolina. It's considered fraud and can result in both civil and criminal penalties. If you're responsible for this, the board needs to know. Patricia stood up abruptly. "This whole thing is a witch hunt. David Henderson comes in here with his fake surveys and tears down everything I built, and now you're all treating me like a criminal. I'm done." She grabbed her purse and stormed out. The room was silent for a moment. Then Sandra sighed. "Richard, what are our options here?" "We need to file a police report," he said. "If Patricia is creating false survey marks, she could be trying to manufacture HOA violations to fine people or create property disputes. That's fraud, possibly even extortion if she's using it to extract money from homeowners. This is beyond HOA business now." The board voted unanimously to file a police report. I provided my documentation and photos, and several other neighbors came forward with their own evidence of suspicious marks on their properties. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department sent an officer to investigate. Detective Sarah Mitchell was a no-nonsense woman in her 30s who took the situation seriously. She interviewed several residents, reviewed the security footage, and examined the spray-painted marks. "These marks don't correspond to any actual property boundaries," she said after comparing them to official plat maps. "Someone is just making things up. That's vandalism at minimum, and potentially fraud." She went to Patricia's house to ask questions. I wasn't there for that conversation, but Tom, who lived nearby, told me it was heated. Patricia had refused to answer questions without an attorney present. The investigation took several weeks. During that time, the spray-painted marks were removed, and the HOA sent out a newsletter explaining the situation and assuring residents that no violations would be enforced based on the false marks. In late May, Detective Mitchell contacted the HOA board with an update. "We've gathered enough evidence to charge Patricia Cunningham with criminal mischief and attempted fraud. She admitted to creating the marks, claiming she was trying to prove that other homeowners had the same kind of boundary issues that David Henderson raised. But her methodology was completely fabricated. She was making up violations to target people she felt had sided against her." Patricia was arrested and charged. The local news picked up the story, running a piece about an HOA president gone rogue. It was embarrassing for Maple Ridge, but most residents felt it was necessary to hold Patricia accountable. The legal process moved slowly. Patricia hired a defense attorney who tried to argue that she had simply made a mistake and hadn't intended to defraud anyone. But the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage, The false marks that didn't match actual property lines, and her own admission that she was targeting specific homeowners all pointed to intentional wrongdoing. In August, Patricia accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to criminal mischief and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the costs of investigating and remediating her actions. As part of the plea deal, she also had to resign from the HOA board entirely and was prohibited from holding any HOA position in the future. The whole experience changed Maple Ridge in significant ways. The new board, led by Sandra, implemented not just rule changes, but cultural changes. They created a process for homeowners to appeal violations and established clear standards for what constituted a real violation versus a minor issue. The newsletter started featuring positive stories about residents instead of just violation notices and demands for compliance. For me, life returned to something resembling normal. My fence stayed exactly where it was. Max continued to enjoy his backyard, and the pool remained open for everyone to use under the terms of the easement I had granted. I even started going there more often, swimming laps in the early mornings before work. One evening in September, I was grilling again, almost exactly 1 year after Patricia had first confronted me about the fence. Tom came over with a 6-pack of beer, and we sat on my back deck watching the sunset. "You know, you really changed this place," Tom said, handing me a beer. "Before you stood up to Patricia, everyone was just living in fear. Now people actually like living here." I took a sip of my beer and shrugged. "I just didn't want to move my fence." Tom laughed. "Yeah, but you could have just rolled over. A lot of people would have. They would have paid to move the fence, even knowing they were right, just to avoid the hassle." "Maybe," I said, "but there's a principle involved. HOAs are supposed to maintain property values and create nice communities. They're not supposed to be little dictatorships where one person gets to harass everyone else." "Well, you proved your point, and you got a free pool out of it." Tom raised his beer in a toast. I clinked my bottle against his. "Here's to property surveys and standing your ground." As we sat there talking, I reflected on the entire crazy journey. It had started with a simple accusation about my fence and had spiraled into uncovering property boundary errors, negotiating easements, reforming HOA rules, and ultimately leading to criminal charges against a vindictive HOA president. It was more drama than I had wanted or expected, but I didn't regret how things had turned out. The following months brought more positive changes to Maple Ridge. The board organized community events that actually brought people together rather than dividing them. A Halloween party, a Christmas light contest, and a spring garden tour all became annual traditions. The focus shifted from enforcement to community building. I even joined the Architectural Review Committee, helping to evaluate requests for home improvements. It was interesting work, and I tried to bring a reasonable, homeowner-friendly perspective to the process. If someone wanted to paint their door a slightly different shade of approved colors, we didn't make it a federal case. If someone wanted to add a small garden shed, we worked with them on placement and appearance rather than throwing up roadblocks. Sandra proved to be an excellent HOA president. She was organized, fair-minded, and genuinely cared about making Maple Ridge a great place to live. Under her leadership, property values actually increased as word spread that the neighborhood had moved away from its reputation as an HOA nightmare. As for Patricia, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved away after her probation ended. Someone said she relocated to another state, possibly to escape the stigma of her criminal conviction. I didn't wish her ill, but I was glad she was no longer in a position to make people's lives miserable. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, documentation is everything. Without that survey from Bill Morrison, I would have had no way to prove that my fence was properly placed or that the pool sat on my property. Second, standing up to bullies is worth it, even when it's uncomfortable. Patricia had been getting away with her behavior for years because people were afraid to challenge her. Third, communities work better when they're based on cooperation rather than coercion. I also learned that property law is more complicated than most people realize. The boundary error that led to the pool being on my land was a genuine mistake from years ago, not intentional wrongdoing by the developer. but it had real legal consequences that had to be addressed properly. If I had been vindictive, I could have demanded the pool be removed, which would have cost the HOA a fortune and destroyed a community amenity. Instead, finding a solution that worked for everyone ended up strengthening the community. My relationship with my neighbors improved dramatically after the whole situation was resolved. People who had barely spoken to me before would stop and chat when they saw me working in the yard. I got invited to backyard barbecues, block parties, and game nights. It turned out that a lot of people had been grateful someone finally stood up to Patricia, but they had been too intimidated to say so while she was still in power. Maria Gonzalez became a good friend. She was a widow in her 60s who had lived in Maple Ridge since it opened. She told me stories about the early days of the development when things had been much more relaxed. Patricia had gradually tightened the rules over the years, using her position to create an atmosphere of constant surveillance and punishment. "You gave us our neighborhood back," Maria said one afternoon while we were both working in our gardens. "I was seriously thinking about selling and moving somewhere else. A lot of us were. But now this feels like home again." One unexpected benefit of the whole situation was that my property value had increased significantly. Having a professionally surveyed property with clear boundaries and documented easements actually made my home more attractive to potential buyers, even though I had no intention of selling. The easement for the pool was recorded properly, meaning any future owner would understand exactly what they were getting. Bill Morrison and I stayed in touch. He told me that the Maple Ridge situation had led to several other developments in the Charlotte area requesting comprehensive surveys to check for similar boundary errors. Apparently, the developer who had built Maple Ridge had worked on several other communities, and there was concern about other mistakes in the original plat maps. "You probably prevented dozens of future legal disputes by catching this now," Bill said. "If that error had gone undiscovered for another 10 or 20 years, it could have been a real mess." The local news did a follow-up story about a year after Patricia's arrest, focusing on how Maple Ridge had transformed from an HOA horror story into a model community. They interviewed Sandra, several residents, and me. I kept my comments brief, emphasizing that the changes were really about common sense and treating people with respect. "We all want to live in nice neighborhoods," I said during the interview. "But that doesn't mean we need to live in fear of our HOA. Rules should be reasonable, enforcement should be fair, and the focus should be on building community, not collecting fines." The story aired on a Friday evening, and by Monday morning, Sandra had received inquiries from 3 other HOA boards in the area, asking for advice on how to reform their own communities. She ended up creating an informal consulting side business, helping other HOAs develop more reasonable rules and enforcement procedures. One thing that surprised me was how the pool situation became a point of pride for the neighborhood. The fact that I had granted an easement rather than forcing removal of a community amenity became part of the Maple Ridge story. When new residents moved in, they would hear about it, and it set a tone of cooperation and community spirit. I made sure the pool area was well maintained since it was technically on my property. The HOA handled day-to-day maintenance as specified in our agreement, but I would occasionally walk through to check on things. I wanted to make sure the liability insurance was current and that safety standards were being followed. It was my land, after all, and I could be held responsible if someone got hurt due to negligence. Max, my golden retriever, became something of a neighborhood celebrity. He was friendly and well-trained, and kids loved playing with him. The fence that had started this whole mess kept him safe and gave him room to run. Looking at him racing around the yard, I was reminded of why I had fought so hard in the first place. It wasn't really about the fence or the pool or even Patricia. It was about having a home where I could live in peace without unreasonable interference. As time went on, the memory of the conflict faded, replaced by new stories and experiences. New board members were elected, bringing fresh perspectives. The rule reforms became the new normal, and younger residents moving in had no memory of the Patricia era. That was probably for the best. I did keep all the documentation from the survey and legal proceedings filed carefully in my home office, just in case. You never know when you might need to prove something about your property boundaries, but I hoped I would never need those documents again. The relationship between homeowners and the HOA became much more collaborative. When issues came up, people talked about them openly rather than living in fear of violation notices. If someone's lawn got a little overgrown because they were on vacation, neighbors might offer to mow it rather than reporting it to the board. If someone wanted to plant a tree that wasn't on the approved list, the architectural committee would work with them to find a similar approved option rather than just saying no. These small changes added up to a fundamentally different living experience. Maple Ridge went from being a place where people felt constantly judged and monitored to a place where people actually wanted to spend time outdoors and interact with their neighbors. Kids played in the streets again. People walked their dogs and stopped to chat. Block parties happened spontaneously, not just as official HOA-sanctioned events. I realized that this was what a homeowners association was supposed to be, not an enforcement mechanism, but a way to bring people together and maintain common standards that everyone agreed on. When done right, an HOA could actually enhance quality of life rather than diminish it. My career benefited from the experience too. I worked as a project manager for a construction company, and the skills I developed during the HOA conflict, dealing with contracts, negotiations, legal documents, and conflict resolution, made me better at my job. My boss noticed the difference and gave me more responsibility on complex projects. Tom Bradshaw and I became close friends. We started a tradition of grilling together every Tuesday evening, weather permitting. He had decades of stories from his time as a firefighter, and I enjoyed hearing about the old days. He had never married and treated me almost like a son, offering advice on everything from home repairs to relationships. "You handled that whole HOA thing like a pro," he told me one evening. "A lot of guys your age would have either backed down or escalated it into a screaming match. You kept your cool, got your facts straight, and solved the problem. That's maturity." I appreciated the compliment, though I wasn't sure I had been quite as composed as Tom remembered. There had been plenty of moments when I had wanted to tell Patricia exactly what I thought of her and her petty tyranny. But I had recognized that losing my temper would only make things worse and give her ammunition to use against me. The easement agreement I had signed with the HOA came up for its annual review each spring. Richard Chen, the attorney, had built in a clause requiring both parties to meet once a year to discuss the arrangement and ensure everyone was satisfied. These meetings were always brief and cordial. The pool was well maintained, the insurance was current, and there were no issues. During the third annual review, Sandra brought up an interesting question. "David, have you ever thought about what will happen with the easement if you sell your property?" "It's part of the recorded deed," I said. "Any buyer would take the property subject to the easement. They couldn't revoke it." "Right, but would they understand it? Would they be as reasonable about the arrangement?" It was a valid concern. I thought about it for a moment. What if we add a clause that gives the HOA the option to purchase that section of land if I ever sell the house? That way, you could own the pool area outright and not have to worry about future property owners. Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually a great idea. We could set a fair price based on comparable land values. It would give the association security and give you a nice bonus if you ever move." We worked out the details over the next few weeks and amended the easement agreement to include a right of first refusal. If I ever sold my property, the HOA could purchase the section where the pool sat for a predetermined formula based on current land values. It was a win-win arrangement. Life settled into a comfortable routine: work, home, time with Max, grilling with Tom, occasional pool visits, and involvement with the HOA architectural committee. It was exactly the kind of stable, peaceful existence I had wanted when I bought the house in Maple Ridge. But every so often, I would walk past my fence and remember that Tuesday evening when Patricia had marched across my lawn with her clipboard. I would remember the anger I had felt at being falsely accused, the determination to prove I was right, and the satisfaction of discovering that I held all the cards in the dispute. It had been stressful and time-consuming, but it had also been empowering. I had learned that you can't just assume people in authority are acting fairly or even legally. You have to verify, document, and stand up for yourself when you're in the right. I had learned that most legal disputes can be resolved through negotiation rather than litigation if both parties are willing to be reasonable. And I had learned that communities are built by people who care enough to fight for positive change, The fence still stood exactly where I had built it, 22 inches inside my property line, a testament to careful planning and proper documentation. Max still ran along it, barking at squirrels and greeting neighbors. And the pool still operated every summer, now sitting on land that was clearly mine but shared with the community through a fair and legal agreement. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had just moved the fence when Patricia demanded it. I would have spent thousands of dollars, lost part of my yard, and reinforced the idea that the HOA could make arbitrary demands without consequence. Patricia would still be president, still terrorizing residents, and the community would still be living under her authoritarian rule. Instead, by standing my ground and doing the research, I had exposed not just Patricia's false accusations, but a deeper property boundary issue that needed to be resolved. I had catalyzed changes that made Maple Ridge a better place to live, and I had demonstrated that ordinary residents could push back against unreasonable HOA actions and win. The story spread beyond Maple Ridge. I heard from friends in other HOA communities who told me they had used my experience as inspiration to challenge their own unreasonable rules. One guy in a development near Lake Norman had successfully fought a fine for having the wrong color mulch in his flower beds. Another woman in a community outside Raleigh had gotten an absurd restriction on holiday decorations overturned. Each of these small victories chipped away at the culture of HOA overreach that had become too common in planned communities across North Carolina and beyond. People were starting to realize that HOA boards derived their power from the consent and participation of residents, not from some inherent authority. When residents organized and demanded reasonable treatment, change was possible. I never sought out a leadership role in the HOA beyond my committee position. I was happy to contribute, but I had no desire to be president or to spend hours arguing about minutia at board meetings. Sandra and the other board members were doing a great job, and I trusted them to continue steering the community in the right direction. But I did make sure to vote in every HOA election and to encourage my neighbors to do the same. Low participation was how people like Patricia got into power in the first place. When only a handful of residents bothered to vote, a small group of zealots could take control and impose their vision on everyone else. Higher participation meant more balanced leadership. The Architectural Review Committee work was actually quite interesting. I got to see the creative ways people wanted to improve their homes, from sunrooms to landscaping to outdoor kitchens. Most requests were reasonable and easy to approve. Occasionally, we would get something unusual that required more discussion, but we always tried to find a way to say yes rather than defaulting to no. One homeowner wanted to install a large metal sculpture in his front yard. It was an abstract piece, kind of industrial looking, and definitely not something the old Patricia era board would have approved. We discussed it at length, considering sight lines, aesthetic impact, and community standards. In the end, we approved it with the condition that it be positioned to minimize visual impact from the street. The homeowner was thrilled, and the sculpture actually became a neighborhood landmark that people gave directions by. These kinds of decisions reflected the new philosophy in Maple Ridge. We weren't trying to make every house look identical. We were trying to maintain reasonable standards while respecting individual taste and property rights. It was a balancing act, but it was working. Max got older, his muzzle turning gray, but he still loved his backyard and his fence. I added a dog door so he could go in and out as he pleased, and he spent hours lying in the sun watching the world go by. When neighborhood kids came over to play with him, his tail would wag so hard his whole body shook. He was a good dog, and he deserved a good life in a peaceful neighborhood. Looking back on the entire experience, from that first confrontation with Patricia to the resolution of the pool situation to the transformation of Maple Ridge, I felt a sense of satisfaction. I had been challenged, and I had risen to meet that challenge. I had used intelligence, documentation, and persistence rather than aggression or capitulation, and I had achieved an outcome that was better than I could have imagined when it all started. The surveyor's discovery that the pool sat on my property could have been a weapon I used to punish the HOA. Instead, I had turned it into an opportunity to create a fair arrangement that benefited everyone. The easement protected the community amenity while securing my property rights. It was creative problem-solving at its best. I thought about the ripple effects of that one decision by Patricia to target my fence. She had wanted to exert her authority and put me in my place. Instead, she had triggered a chain of events that exposed her own misconduct, cost her position and reputation, resulted in criminal charges, and ultimately transformed an entire community. All because she couldn't let people live in peace. There was a lesson in that about the dangers of petty authoritarianism. When people get a little bit of power, some of them become intoxicated by it. They start looking for ways to use that power, to demonstrate their authority, to make people submit. Patricia had been that kind of person. She had confused her role as HOA president with being some kind of neighborhood dictator. But communities are stronger than any one person's desire for control. When residents work together and demand reasonable treatment, positive change is possible. Maple Ridge was proof of that. We had gone from dysfunction to functionality, from fear to cooperation, from conflict to community. As I sat on my deck on a warm spring evening, 3 years after the whole saga began, I looked out at my fence, perfectly placed within my property boundaries. I thought about Bill Morrison and his precise measurements. I thought about Richard Chen and his patient negotiations. I thought about Sandra Lewis and her genuine desire to lead fairly. I thought about Tom and Maria and all my other neighbors who had supported me and supported the changes. And I thought about Patricia, wherever she was, hopefully learning from her mistakes and living a life that didn't revolve around controlling others. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Max was snoring at my feet. Tom was walking over with his usual six-pack for our Tuesday evening ritual. And somewhere in the background, I could hear kids laughing at the community pool, enjoying the facility that sat on my land but belonged to everyone. It was a good life in a good community. And it had all started with a fence and a false accusation from an HOA president who had pushed too far. I had stood my ground, done my homework, and found a better way forward. That was something I could be proud of. The fence stayed where it was, a silent monument to property rights and proper surveys. The pool stayed where it was, serving the community under a fair easement. And Maple Ridge continued to thrive as a place where people wanted to live, not because they were forced to follow arbitrary rules, but because it was genuinely a nice place to call home. As Tom arrived and handed me a cold beer, I raised it in a toast. To good fences, accurate surveys, and reasonable HOAs. Tom clinked his bottle against mine with a grin. And to neighbors who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. We drank to that, and to the sunset, and to the simple pleasure of being home. And that, in the end, was what it had all been about. Not the legal battles or the property lines, or even the satisfaction of proving Patricia wrong. It was about having a home where I could live in peace, grill my burgers, play with my dog, and enjoy the company of good neighbors. Mission accomplished.